Welcome to the Drowsy Historian, where history hits different when you're half asleep at 2 a.m. Yawn. Hey there, fellow insomniacs and history nerds. Welcome to the Drowsy Historian, the only channel where we dig into the darkest, weirdest, and most messed up stories from the past while you're supposed to be sleeping. I'm your host, and yes, I sound tired because I am tired. But you know what? History is way more interesting when you're deliriously exhausted and questioning everything about human civilization. Tonight, we're going underground, literally. We're talking about medieval miners in the Austrian Alps, and spoiler alert, it was absolutely horrific. Like, makes your worst Monday look like a spa day horrific. So grab your favourite late-night snack, get comfortable, and let's dive into a story that'll make you grateful for literally any other job in human history. Chapter 1. The Devil's Doorway. Alright, night owls, picture this. It's 1347, somewhere in the Austrian Alps. The sun's barely peeking over those gorgeous snow-capped mountains that look so pretty on Instagram today. But Hans Bergman, yeah, that's literally Mountain Man, because medieval people had zero creativity with surnames, isn't admiring the view. He's staring down into what the locals cheerfully called the Devil's Doorway, a hole in the ground so dark and terrifying that even the church refused to bless it. Smart move, honestly. Now, here's where it gets fun. Hans has exactly two life choices. Go down that hole every single day and probably die horribly, or starve to death up here in the fresh air. Spoiler alert, medieval economic systems were basically elaborate suicide machines with extra steps. The entrance to these Alpine silver mines wasn't some neat little elevator shaft. Oh no. Picture a jagged gash torn into the mountainside, maybe 4 feet wide if you're lucky, supported by whatever rotting timber they could scavenge. The locals called it God's asshole, though the priests preferred the Devil's Doorway, because apparently even medieval clergy had some standards. Hans would arrive at dawn with Klaus Steinbrecher, Stonebreaker, because again, medieval naming conventions were basically medieval job descriptions. These two poor bastards represent about 80% of the mining workforce, desperate peasants who'd rather risk getting crushed to death than face another winter eating bark soup. Here's your fun fact for insomniacs. The average life expectancy of an Alpine miner was 28 years. And that's not died peacefully in his sleep at 28. That's got flattened by a boulder, drowned in freezing mine water, or slowly suffocated from lung rot at 28. The lucky ones made it to 35 and got to wheeze themselves to death in relative comfort. But wait, it gets worse. The mine owners, usually some local noble who'd never set foot underground, charged the miners for their tools. That's right. You paid for the privilege of using shitty equipment that would probably kill you. It's like paying your murderer for the knife. The descent itself was pure nightmare fuel. Imagine lowering yourself down a rope, not a good rope mind you, but whatever hemp garbage they could afford, into complete darkness. No headlamps, no safety harnesses, just you, a flickering candle, and gravity waiting to introduce you to bedrock at terminal velocity. The wooden ladders? Let's just say medieval carpentry standards were good enough to maybe not collapse immediately. Hans would test each rung because the guy before him might be decorating the mine floor 200 feet down. Quality control was basically natural selection with wooden steps. And here's the kicker, they went down singing. Not because they were happy, but because silence meant someone had died. The songs weren't cheerful either. Popular hits included Mary, Mother of Miners, Pray for Our Crushed Bodies, and the crowd favourite, St. Barbara, Why Have You Forsaken Us? Klaus once told Hans that going down the mine felt like being swallowed by the mountain. Poetic for a guy who couldn't read, but also disturbingly accurate, because once you went down there, the mountain literally started digesting you. Slowly. The worst part? They did this voluntarily. Well, as voluntary as anything gets when your other options are starvation, banditry, or joining the church. And let's be honest, medieval monks weren't exactly living it up either. Next time you complain about your commute, remember Hans and Klaus. So Hans and Klaus have successfully not died during the descent, Congratulations, you've achieved the absolute bare minimum. Now comes the fun part, actually working in what can only be described as nature's most sadistic basement. Picture the worst basement you've ever been in. Now remove all the light, flood it with freezing water, fill it with poisonous gas, and add the constant threat of being buried alive. Oh, and make it smaller. Way smaller. We're talking tunnels so narrow that Hans had to crawl on his belly for half his shift, dragging his pathetic mining tools behind him like some kind of medieval worm. The temperature down there? A balmy 40 degrees year round. That might sound refreshing until you realise you're soaking wet, working with metal tools, and your work clothes are basically rags. Hypothermia wasn't a medical condition, it was Tuesday. Here's where Klaus comes in handy. See, Klaus had been doing this nightmare job for 3 whole years, which made him basically Gandalf among miners. His job was teaching new guys like Hans the ancient art of not dying immediately. His first lesson? If you can't see your hand in front of your face, the air's probably trying to kill you. Medieval mine ventilation was, let's call it, optimistic. They'd dig a second shaft for airflow, assuming they could afford it. Most couldn't. So you'd have 20 guys working in a space designed for maybe 5, all breathing each other's exhaust, while carbon monoxide quietly turned their brains into mush. The lucky ones passed out. The unlucky ones stayed conscious long enough to realise what was happening. But wait, there's more. The Austrians had discovered something beautiful in these mountains, silver ore. Unfortunately, it was mixed with lead, arsenic, and other delightful minerals that medieval science couldn't identify, but definitely recognised as the stuff that makes people die weird deaths. Klaus had developed what he called miner's wisdom, basically a collection of superstitions that occasionally kept people alive by accident. Don't work alone. Someone needs to drag your corpse out. Don't trust any beam that creaks. All beams creak. And never, ever follow the glowing lights, that swamp gas, and it explodes. The work itself was brutally simple. Find rock with silver veins. Hit rock with hammer until silver comes out. Repeat until you die. The tools were a Bronze Age chisel, a hammer that would be rejected by modern garage sales, and whatever wooden buckets they could scrounge up. High-tech medieval mining equipment, folks. Here's your delightful fact of the day. Miners measured their shifts not by hours, but by candles. You went down with 3 candles, you came up when they burned out, except candles burn faster in low oxygen. So on bad air days, you'd think you'd worked half a shift when you'd actually been down there for 10 hours, slowly suffocating. The worst part wasn't even the dying, it was the not knowing when you'd die. Hans spent every shift listening for the creaking sounds that meant the ceiling was about to introduce itself to his skull. Klaus had developed an impressive collection of scars from little accidents, a falling rock here, a tool malfunction there, the occasional mild explosion. And the mine owners? They measured success by silver output, not miner survival. Dead miners were a business expense, like broken tools. They'd literally calculate whether it was cheaper to improve safety or just recruit more desperate peasants. Guess which option usually won? The mine shafts twisted and branched like a drunk spider's web because medieval engineering was basically dig until you hit something valuable or something kills you. No maps, no planning, just holes connected to other holes in whatever pattern seemed reasonable at the time. Chapter 2. When the mountain eats you alive. Welcome back to humanity's worst career choice, you beautiful insomniacs. Last time we left Hans and Klaus breathing poison in a frozen cave. Tonight's topic: how medieval Austrian mountains had a delightful habit of spontaneously rearranging themselves, usually with miners still inside. Picture this. It's Tuesday morning, 1348. Hans is down in his favourite death trap, chiselling away at some silver ore when he hears it. That lovely creaking sound that means several tons of rock are about to become his very personal avalanche. Medieval mine safety protocol: run like hell and pray to St. Barbara, patron saint of please don't let me become mountain paste. Here's your fun geological fact. The Austrian Alps are basically a pile of rocks held together by wishful thinking and gravity. Add a bunch of idiots with hammers digging random holes, and you've created nature's most elaborate game of Jenga. Except when this Jenga tower falls, it doesn't knock over your coffee. It turns miners into human pancakes. Klaus had survived 3 cave-ins by pure luck and what he called rock whispering, listening to the mountain's mood swings. The mountain talks, he'd tell new miners, and when it says creek, it means run, you stupid bastard. Medieval safety training at its finest. The real kicker? Mine owners knew exactly which areas were death traps. They'd mark the dangerous sections with absolutely nothing. No signs, no warnings, just a casual, "Oh yeah, that tunnel collapsed last week and ate Johann. Try not to go there." Because warning signs cost money, and dead miners just meant more job openings. Medieval mining engineering was basically dig until something bad happens. No support structures beyond whatever rotting timber they could scavenge. No geological surveys, those wouldn't be invented for another 400 years. Just men with medieval tools playing Russian roulette with mountain physics. Here's where it gets beautifully absurd. The church declared that miners killed in cave-ins went straight to heaven because they died in service to God's bounty. How convenient. Your earthly suffering ends when a boulder crushes you. But don't worry, eternal paradise awaits. The mine owners probably sponsored that particular theological interpretation. Klaus once watched a cave-in swallow 6 men in about 3 seconds. Just gone. The sound, he said, was like the mountain burping after a big meal. The mine owner's response? They marked the area as temporarily inaccessible and docked the dead miners' pay for incomplete shifts, because apparently dying on the job was basically quitting without notice. The aftermath of cave-ins was pure medieval horror. Sometimes they'd dig out bodies, sometimes they couldn't. Many miners just became permanent parts of the mountain architecture. Their families got nothing. No compensation, no apology, just a casual, "Sorry, Klaus got mountainized." Next. But here's the truly insane part. Survivors would go back to work the next day. Same mine, same conditions, same inevitable death sentence. Because the alternative was starving, and at least cave-ins were quick. Medieval economic systems, making sudden violent death look like a reasonable career choice since 1000 AD. Hans developed his own cave-in survival strategy, worked near Klaus, who seemed to have supernatural rock-sensing abilities. Klaus's secret? Pure paranoia and 3 years of watching friends become geological features. He'd test every beam, listen for every creak, and bolt at the first sign of mountain indigestion. The water didn't trickle in politely like a leaky basement. Oh no. When Alpine mines flooded, they flooded with the enthusiasm of a mountain stream that had just discovered gravity. Hans watched Klaus drop his tools and bolt toward the exit, screaming warnings that basically translated to water, run, swim, pray, not necessarily in that order. Medieval mine drainage was, well, let's call it aspirational. They'd dig little channels to direct water away, assuming the water would politely follow their suggestions. Spoiler alert, underground rivers don't negotiate. They just show up unannounced and redecorate your workplace into an aquarium. The real comedy? Mine owners would charge miners for water removal services. That's right, when the mine flooded and nearly drowned you, you got to pay for the privilege of maybe getting the water pumped out. Eventually, if they felt like it. Medieval capitalism, making near-death experiences into revenue streams since forever. Hans barely made it to higher ground before watching his work area transform into an underground lake. 3 miners didn't make it. Johann the Unlucky, yes, that was his actual nickname, Fat Wilhelm, and some new guy whose name nobody bothered learning. They just disappeared under the black water, along with a week's worth of silver ore and everyone's tools. Klaus, soaking wet and furious, explained the water situation to Hans. The mountain pisses when it wants to piss. Sometimes it's a little sprinkle, sometimes it's the fucking biblical flood, and we just have to deal with it because the Lord needs his silver coins. Here's your delightful medieval engineering fact. Their advanced water pump system was basically a bucket brigade with extra steps. They'd set up human chains to bail out flooded sections, paying miners to stand knee-deep in freezing underground rivers, passing buckets up to the surface for 12 hours in the dark, while hypothermia slowly shut down their organs. The flooded sections became underwater graveyards. Bodies, tools, support beams, everything just sank into these black pools that nobody wanted to drain because it was too expensive. Mine owners would simply seal off flooded areas and pretend they never existed. Problem solved. Well, except for the ghosts of drowned miners that Klaus swore he could hear gurgling in the deeper tunnels. The water was always freezing. Mountain runoff doesn't exactly come with central heating. Miners who fell in and survived often lost fingers, toes, or entire limbs to frostbite. Klaus had seen tough men reduced to blubbering children after 5 minutes in flooded mine shafts. The lucky ones passed out from shock and drowned quickly. But here's the absolutely insane part. They kept working around these death pools. Hans would spend his shifts listening to the sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness, knowing that any moment another underground river might decide to join the party. Sleep well tonight, knowing that medieval miners went to work every day in what was basically an underground Russian roulette game with geology. Chapter 3. The Widowmakers. All right, fellow night creatures, let's talk about medieval mining tools. And by tools, I mean devices specifically engineered to maim you in creative ways while you desperately try to extract shiny rocks from an actively hostile mountain. Hans stood there dripping wet from the recent flood, looking at his equipment, with the kind of despair usually reserved for tax audits or blind dates. His toolkit consisted of a hammer that had probably been used to build Noah's Ark, a chisel that looked like it had been gnawed by particularly aggressive beavers, and a wooden bucket that leaked more than it held. Medieval craftsmanship at its absolute finest, folks. Klaus handed Hans his personal favourite, a pickaxe with a wooden handle held together by rope, prayer, and what appeared to be dried blood from previous owners. This beauty killed 3 men before me, Klaus announced cheerfully, like he was introducing a beloved family pet. Hans the Tall got his skull caved in when the head flew off mid-swing. Wilhelm the Short took a chunk of metal to the eye. And poor Johann. Well, let's just say he learned why you don't use mining tools as walking sticks in the dark. The hammerheads were forged by local blacksmiths who clearly operated under the philosophy of good enough to probably not explode immediately. These weren't precision instruments. They were chunks of barely refined iron attached to sticks with all the structural integrity of a medieval marriage contract. The metal was so soft it would deform after a few good whacks, turning your mining tool into abstract sculpture. Here's your cheerful medieval fact. The average mining tool lasted about 3 weeks before breaking in a way that endangered everyone within swinging distance. Mine owners, being the generous souls they were, would charge miners full price for replacement tools while buying them in bulk from whoever submitted the lowest bid. Quality control was basically, did it kill the tester immediately? No? Ship it. Hans quickly learned that using these tools was like playing Russian roulette with every swing. The chisel points would snap off and become airborne projectiles. Hammer handles would split lengthwise, sending splinters into your hands that would fester into gangrenous infections. And the pickaxes, sweet medieval Jesus, the pickaxes were basically elaborate suicide devices disguised as work equipment. Klaus demonstrated proper mining technique, which mostly involved protecting your vital organs while attempting to extract silver ore. See, you hold the chisel like this, he explained, positioning it so that when the inevitable tool failure occurred, he'd only lose a finger instead of his entire hand. And you swing the hammer like you're trying to kill the mountain before it kills you, because that's literally what's happening. The wooden buckets deserved special mention in the annals of medieval engineering disasters. Made from whatever scrap wood they could find, held together with iron bands that rusted in about 30 seconds, these containers had one job: carry rocks from point A to point B. They failed spectacularly. Hans watched one bucket disintegrate mid-lift sending a week's worth of silver ore cascading back into the mine shaft, along with what remained of his will to live. The rope used throughout the mine was hemp that had the tensile strength of overcooked spaghetti. Klaus showed Hans the safety features. Knots tied every few feet so that when the rope inevitably broke, you'd only fall 20 feet instead of 200. It's all about managing expectations, Klaus explained with the wisdom of a man who had survived more equipment failures than medieval medicine could reasonably explain. But here's the beautiful irony. Miners had to maintain their own tools. After a 12-hour shift of nearly dying, they'd spend their evening sharpening chisels, replacing handles, and trying to repair equipment that was fundamentally designed to break. It was like being forced to perform surgery on the knife that was currently stabbing you. The most terrifying part about medieval mining tools wasn't their tendency to break. It was when they encountered the mountain's secret weapon, naturally occurring explosive gases. Hans was about to learn that striking metal against rock in an enclosed space filled with methane was basically playing Russian roulette with a grenade. Klaus grabbed Hans's arm just as he was about to swing his pickaxe into a promising silver vein. "Wait, you smell that?" Klaus whispered, his voice carrying the kind of fear usually reserved for plague announcements or tax collectors. Hans sniffed the air and caught it, a sweet, rotten egg smell that made his stomach turn. "That's the mountain farting," Klaus explained with his usual poetic flair. "And if you make a spark right now, we'll both be having a very brief conversation with St. Peter." Medieval miners had discovered methane gas the hard way by accidentally creating underground fireworks shows that turned their colleagues into crispy mining statistics. The gas would seep out of rock cracks, pool in low areas, and wait patiently for some unfortunate soul to create a spark. The resulting explosions weren't Hollywood-style fireballs. They were instantaneous, devastating blasts that would cave in tunnels, incinerate anyone nearby, and leave the survivors with the delightful task of identifying their co-workers by dental records. Here's your fun medieval chemistry lesson. They had absolutely no understanding of what methane was, where it came from, or how to detect it safely. Their gas detection system was basically swing your pickaxe and hope for the best. Some mines employed canary miners, guys whose job was to walk into suspicious areas with open flames and see what happened. It was a position with excellent advancement opportunities, assuming you survived long enough to advance anywhere. Hans watched Klaus demonstrate the ancient art of maybe not dying from gas explosions. First, you sniffed around like a confused dog. If the air smelled weird, you backed away slowly. If your candle flame turned blue or started dancing, you ran like hell. And if you heard a whooshing sound followed by complete silence, you kissed your ass goodbye because the explosion was already en route. The mining tools made everything worse because they were specifically designed to create sparks. Metal striking stone in an oxygen-poor environment was bad enough, but add invisible explosive gas, and you've got a recipe for what Klaus called the mountain's revenge. Every swing of the pickaxe was potentially your last, not because of cave-ins or flooding, but because you might accidentally trigger a blast that would redecorate the tunnel walls with your internal organs. But here's the absolutely insane part. They kept working in gassy areas because that's where the best silver ore was found. Mine owners would offer hazard pay, an extra turnip per day, for miners willing to work in sections where the previous shift had been mysteriously vaporized. Medieval risk management at its finest. Klaus had survived 2 gas explosions, which made him basically Merlin among miners. The first one had singed off his eyebrows and given him permanent hearing damage. The second had killed 4 men standing 10 feet away while leaving him with nothing but a headache and trust issues. His survival strategy was pure superstition mixed with paranoid caution. He'd mutter prayers to St. Barbara while testing every surface for gas leaks with techniques that were only slightly more scientific than throwing salt over his shoulder. Chapter 4. Coughing up silver. So far we've covered cave-ins, drowning, and explosive tools. Tonight's topic: how Austrian Alpine miners developed the world's most creative lung diseases while slowly suffocating on their own work environment. Hans had survived his first month underground, which made him practically a veteran. But Klaus noticed something troubling. Hans had developed what miners cheerfully called the black cough. Every morning, Hans would hack up progressively darker chunks of lung tissue mixed with rock dust, creating what looked like medieval abstract art on the tunnel walls. "Congratulations," Klaus wheezed between his own coughing fits. "You're officially becoming part of the mountain." Medieval understanding of lung disease was roughly equivalent to their understanding of quantum physics, non-existent with a dash of religious superstition. The prevailing medical theory was that bad air was punishment for insufficient prayer, combined with the helpful belief that coughing up blood meant your body was purging evil humours. The prescribed treatment? More prayer, and maybe some wine, if you could afford it. Spoiler alert, miners couldn't afford wine. The air quality in these mines was basically a cocktail of everything that could kill you slowly. Rock dust from chiselling, metal particles from tool wear, mysterious gas emissions from the mountain itself, and the accumulated breath of 20 terrified men working in a space designed for maybe 5. Hans was essentially smoking a pack of geological cigarettes every day, except cigarettes hadn't been invented yet, so he couldn't even enjoy the experience. Klaus had been breathing this toxic soup for 4 years, which explained why he sounded like a broken bellows whenever he tried to speak above a whisper. His morning routine involved 20 minutes of violent coughing that produced samples from what appeared to be his entire respiratory system. "The mountain's claiming me piece by piece," he'd joke, examining the latest horrific glob he'd expelled. "Pretty soon there won't be enough." Klaus left to fill a mining bucket. "Here's your delightful medical fact for tonight. Medieval miners typically died from lung disease before they reached 30, but it wasn't a quick death. Oh no, that would be too merciful. Instead, they'd spend months slowly drowning in their own fluids while their lung capacity decreased week by week. They'd gasp for air while sitting still, struggle to lift their pathetic mining tools, and eventually become too weak to climb out of the mine shaft. Medieval occupational health and safety at its absolute finest. The really beautiful part was how mine owners handled sick miners. Can't work, no pay, can't breathe, not their problem. Coughing up blood, probably malingering. The official medical policy was basically work until you die, then get out of the way so we can hire your replacement. They'd actually dock sick miners' pay for the days they spent dying because apparently terminal lung disease was considered a lifestyle choice. Hans watched older miners struggle through their shifts, wheezing and gasping between each swing of their pickaxes. Some would collapse mid-work and just lie there, too exhausted to move, while their shift partners stepped over them to continue chiseling. It was like a preview of his own future, assuming he lived long enough to develop full-blown miner's lung. The dust was everywhere, in your hair, your clothes, your food, your water. Hans would blow his nose and produce black snot that looked like liquid coal. He'd wake up with his mouth full of grit and spend his days spitting out chunks of mountain. Even his sweat was dirty, leaving dark streaks on his skin that made him look like he was slowly transforming into a rock formation. But here's the truly insane part. They knew the air was killing them. Klaus would point to sealed-off sections where previous miners had literally coughed themselves to death, leaving behind dark stains on the tunnel walls. "That's where Johann the Wheezer spent his last shift," Klaus would explain casually. "Coughed so hard he turned inside out. We named that corner after him." So Hans was slowly transforming into a human rock formation through his daily dose of lung poison, when he discovered the next delightful aspect of medieval mining life, the food situation. And by food situation, I mean how to maintain the illusion of being alive while subsisting on whatever garbage the mine owners felt like throwing at their expendable workforce. Picture this. Hans climbs out of his underground death trap after 12 hours of nearly dying, covered in toxic dust, coughing up pieces of his respiratory system, and what awaits him? A bowl of what Klaus generously called soup, but what appeared to be dirty water with occasional chunks of mystery floating in it. "That's turnip," Klaus explained, pointing to a suspicious brown lump. Or maybe rat. Hard to tell in this light. Medieval mining wages were calculated using advanced economic theory that basically boiled down to pay them just enough to not immediately die of starvation, but not enough to actually live. Hans received his weekly compensation: 2 loaves of bread that had the consistency of building materials, a handful of turnips that looked like they'd been rejected by more discerning vegetables, and whatever protein they could scrounge up. And by protein, I mean anything that used to be alive and wasn't completely rotten yet. The bread deserves special mention in the annals of medieval culinary disasters. Baked from whatever grain was too mouldy for human consumption, mixed with sawdust for bulk, and aged to the perfect consistency of stone tablets, this bread was less food and more construction material. Hans had to soak it in water for 20 minutes just to bite it without breaking his teeth. Klaus used old bread as hammer handles, lasts longer than wood, and tastes about the same, he'd joke while gnawing on what might have once been a dinner roll. Here's your fun medieval nutrition fact. Miners burned about 4,000 calories per day doing back-breaking labor in hostile conditions, while consuming maybe 1,200 calories of actual food. The math was simple. They were slowly starving to death while working themselves to death in an environment trying to kill them in 17 different ways. It's like someone designed the perfect weight loss program, assuming you wanted to lose weight by dying. The turnips were particularly special. These weren't the nice, fresh turnips you might imagine. These were the turnips that other turnips rejected for being too disgusting. Wrinkled, sprouting mysterious growths, and possessing flavors that defied description, they were basically nature's way of saying "fuck you" in vegetable form. Hans had learned to chop them into tiny pieces and mix them with whatever water he could find, creating a gruel that tasted like disappointment with hints of soil. Klaus had developed what he called miner's cuisine, creative ways to make inedible food slightly less likely to kill you immediately. He'd char the turnips to hide their natural horror, mix breadcrumbs with mine water to create paste, and occasionally catch rats to add what he optimistically called flavor. The rats, incidentally, were probably eating better than the miners. The really beautiful part was how mine owners justified this nutritional nightmare. Miners don't need fancy food, they'd declare while feasting on actual meat and vegetables. Hard work builds character, and turnips they build something. This from men who considered a meal incomplete without at least 3 types of meat and wine that cost more than a miner's annual salary. Hans quickly learned that hunger was just another occupational hazard, like cave-ins or tool-related injuries. You worked while your stomach cramped, swung your pickaxe while your body consumed its own muscle tissue, and tried not to think about food while breathing poison in a frozen cave. Medieval multitasking at its finest. The water situation was equally delightful. Their drinking supply came from the same mountain streams that flooded the mines, filtered through whatever cloth they could scrounge up, and stored in containers that had previously held everything from wine to waste. Hans would drink this liquid and pray it wouldn't kill him faster than the lung disease or the inevitable cave-in. Chapter 5. The piss-poor life above ground. All right, night owls. So Hans has survived another delightful day of nearly dying underground while eating medieval garbage. Time to explore what passed for home sweet home in a medieval Austrian mining village. Spoiler alert, it makes the death trap underground look like a luxury resort. Hans trudged up the mountainside after his shift, still coughing up geological samples, toward what Klaus cheerfully called the village. And by village, I mean a collection of structures that would make homeless camps look like gated communities. Picture 20 ramshackle buildings thrown together by people who had clearly never heard of concepts like structural integrity or basic human dignity. His house was a generous term for what was essentially a wooden box with delusions of grandeur. Hans shared this architectural marvel with Klaus and 4 other miners, because apparently medieval housing developers operated under the principle of cram as many dying men as possible into the smallest space imaginable. The entire structure was maybe 12 feet by 8 feet, with a ceiling so low that standing upright required the flexibility of a medieval contortionist. The walls were made from whatever lumber the mine owners felt like discarding: rotting planks, broken support beams, and what appeared to be pieces of previous houses that had collapsed from shame. The gaps between boards were stuffed with mud, straw, and optimism, creating a ventilation system that kept the interior temperature roughly equivalent to the bottom of an Alpine lake. Klaus had nicknamed their home the Coffin because, as he put it, "We're just practicing for the real thing." Here's your delightful medieval real estate fact. Miners paid rent for these death traps. That's right. After spending 12 hours nearly dying underground for subsistence wages, they handed over half their turnip-based income to live in structures that violated every building code that wouldn't be invented for another 400 years. Medieval landlords, making slumlords look ethical since forever. The sleeping arrangements were particularly civilized. 6 grown men shared what could generously be called floor space, using whatever cloth they could scrounge as blankets and whatever softish objects they could find as pillows. Hans slept between Klaus, who wheezed like a broken accordion all night, and Otto the Unlucky, who had earned his nickname by surviving 7 different mining accidents and apparently used all his luck up in the process. The heating system was advanced, medieval technology, a hole in the roof that let smoke out and weather in. They built a fire in the center of the room using whatever combustible materials they could steal. Broken mining tools, scraps of wood, and occasionally pieces of their own shelter when things got desperate. The smoke would eventually find its way out through the roof hole, after first coating everything inside with a fine layer of soot and carcinogens. But wait, it gets better. The village had exactly one, shared by about 200 people, located conveniently at the bottom of a hill, so that all the human waste from the settlement could drain directly into their water supply. Medieval urban planning at its absolute finest. Hans would wake up every morning, stumble outside to piss in the communal drainage area, then walk 50 yards to drink from the same water source. It's like someone designed a system specifically to maximize disease transmission. The sanitation facilities were what you'd expect from a settlement built by people who considered turnips a luxury food item. There was a communal latrine, basically a hole in the ground surrounded by rotting wood, that served the entire mining community. The smell was so spectacular that Klaus claimed you could navigate to it blindfolded from half a mile away. "Follow your nose," he'd joke, "and when you start retching, you're close." Privacy was a concept that medieval mining communities had apparently never heard of. Hans learned to conduct all personal business, bathing, changing clothes, having nervous breakdowns about his life choices, in full view of his roommates. Medieval miners developed the social skills of people who had long since abandoned any hope of dignity or personal space. Hans woke up one morning to the usual cacophony of coughs, creaks, and the distant sound of someone getting their ass kicked over a piece of mouldy bread. Living in the mining village was like being trapped in a social experiment designed by someone with a very dark sense of humor and a complete disregard for human dignity. The community dynamics were basically Lord of the Flies meets The Walking Dead, except everyone was already half dead from lung disease and malnutrition. The social hierarchy was beautifully simple. Everyone was equally fucked, but some people were slightly less fucked than others. Klaus had achieved the coveted status of senior miner, which meant he got to boss around the newer guys right up until the mountain killed him. Hans, being relatively new to the dying, slowly underground profession, ranked somewhere between human shield and expendable meat. The pecking order was ruthlessly maintained through a combination of seniority, survival skills, and the ability to intimidate people who were too tired to fight back. Village entertainment consisted mainly of betting on which miner would die next and how spectacularly it would happen. Klaus had a running pool going on, whether Hans would succumb to lung rot, cave-in, or what he called general mountain-induced mortality. The odds weren't great. Hans was currently running 3-1 for death by stupidity and 5-1 for survives long enough to regret it. Here's your fun medieval social dynamics fact. Miners developed their own twisted code of ethics based entirely on survival pragmatism. Stealing food from a dying man was acceptable if you needed it more. Claiming someone else's tools when they got crushed was considered efficient resource management. and lying about safety conditions to new miners was practically a religious obligation. If they were dumb enough to believe you, they deserved what they got. The women in the village had drawn the cosmic short straw in ways that made the miners' situation look enviable. They got to watch their husbands, sons and brothers disappear into the mountain every morning, knowing that each goodbye might be permanent. Then they spent their days trying to keep families alive on turnip-based diets while living in structures that barely qualified as shelter. Medieval feminism at its absolute finest. Klaus's wife, Greta, had perfected the art of what she called widow preparation. She'd already mentally divided Klaus's possessions among the neighbours, practiced her mourning face, and started eyeing potential replacement husbands. Not because she was heartless, but because sentimentality was a luxury that got you killed faster than bad mine air. When Klaus inevitably became mountain paste, she needed to be ready to remarry within a week or face starvation. The village kids were particularly delightful examples of medieval childhood development. By age 8, they were experts in identifying different types of lung disease by sound alone. By 10, they could accurately predict mine accidents based on their father's morning cough patterns. And by 12, they were ready to join the family business of slow suicide for minimal compensation. Social gatherings centered around the tavern, which was basically a wooden box where miners went to drink liquid that might have been beer at some point in its evolutionary history. The conversation topics were limited but consistent: whose turn it was to die, how much the mine owners sucked, and detailed comparisons of different types of horrible deaths they'd witnessed. Hans learned that medieval miners had developed very specific vocabulary for describing the various ways mountains could kill people. The religious situation was equally uplifting. The village priest, Father Wilhelm, had apparently given up any pretense of offering hope, and instead specialized in preparing people for immediate death. His sermons focused on accepting your inevitable doom with grace and making sure your soul was properly prepared for the afterlife, since your body was obviously beyond salvation. Sunday Mass was basically a weekly funeral service for people who weren't quite dead yet. Chapter 6. The Master's Iron Fist. All right, fellow insomniacs, it's time to meet the real villains of the medieval Alpine mining saga, the masters, lords and noblemen who owned the mines and fed off the blood, sweat and crushed bones of poor bastards like Hans and Klaus. These guys were the original corporate overlords, masters of exploitation and masters of the why didn't they just leave paradox. The mine owners were often distant nobles who lived in cozy castles far away from the mud, misery and slowly dying miners. They had no interest in the miners' welfare beyond ensuring enough silver flowed into their coffers to fund their lavish lifestyles. Imagine a Renaissance-era boardroom, except the employees were literally enslaved peasants risking death daily, while the bosses sipped wine and debated art patronage, and possibly whether the new velvet on their chairs was flattering enough. Hans quickly understood that any attempt to complain about conditions, wages or safety wasn't just pointless, it was dangerous. Complaints were met with cold silence or harsh punishment. Some unlucky miners had accidents or disappearances that conveniently discouraged dissent. The mine owners demanded brutal quotas designed to suck every ounce of ore from the mountain, operating on the merciless philosophy that dead miners could be replaced as easily as broken tools. Failing to meet quotas due to injury, illness, or accidents didn't earn sympathy or rest, it simply added to the miners' debt. The same debt that was spun like a spider's web to entangle men and their families into lifelong servitude. If Hans missed a quota because he was crushed by falling rock or sick from poison gases, the fines meant his wages vanished, and he owed the owners more than he could ever earn, effectively binding him and anyone he left behind to a cycle of poverty and despair. These masters had perfected a brutal calculus long before the term industrial capitalism existed. They calculated how many miners would die before the mine became unprofitable, factoring humans into their ledgers as mere numbers. Profit came first. People were expendable. Hans and Klaus's grim nickname for these overlords was the Bone Collectors, And for good reason. To them, miners weren't worth more than the ores they extracted, and death was just an inconvenient bookkeeping issue. The mine owners controlled every aspect of miners' lives beyond the tunnels too. Miners were forced to buy their tools, food and lodging on credit at outrageous prices from the very owners who paid them pitiful wages. This system of debt created a medieval debt peonage. Mines were prisons without bars, and wages were paychecks paid only in promises and paper chains. Religion wasn't just a comfort. It was a tool wielded by the masters and the church to stamp out rebellion. Preachers came down from the lofty pews preaching that miners' suffering was God's punishment or holy sacrifice, making resistance not only futile but sinful. "Blessed are the poor and persecuted," the sermons went, "for their spirits will inherit the kingdom of heaven." Meanwhile, the lords were enjoying earthly kingdoms built on miners' misery. Hans realized that the entire system, from the mountain's deadly embrace to the callous lords above, had conspired to drain every ounce of humanity from miners and their families. Every day underground was a battle against nature, health, and a social order built to exploit and discard the desperate men who kept silver flowing. But even in this darkness, the human spirit flickered stubbornly. Klaus often said, "One day the mountain might swallow us all, but until then we're here fighting." And it wasn't just a fight against death. It was a silent, relentless rebellion against those who profited from their pain. And so the cycle continued. Exploitation, feeding on desperation, silver gleaming as bright as the miners' shattered dreams. The mountain was a merciless mistress, but so were the men who claimed her wealth, indifferent to the cost in human lives. Many historians have written about the economic models that allowed these lords to flourish, but it's easy to forget the human cost buried beneath the glossy ledgers and elegant castles. Each silver coin had a price measured in shattered families, broken backs, and lungs filled with poison dust. Yet the masters counted only profits, indifferent to the silent screams echoing beneath the mountains. Hans and Klaus were just two numbers in an endless spreadsheet, but their stories reveal the ugly truth behind medieval prosperity. The system relied on keeping miners desperate, indebted, and voiceless. Attempts to organize or strike were quickly crushed, rumors of revolt stamped out by intimidation, disappearances, or worse. And so, the mountain chewed on these men, the masters counted their coins, and the cycle perpetuated itself, each facet feeding the other in a perfect storm of exploitation. Klaus explained the system with his usual dark wisdom. They pay you just enough to keep you alive, then charge you just enough to keep you broke. It's like drowning, but with extra steps and more paperwork. Medieval employers had perfected the art of making their workers pay for the privilege of being exploited. The tool rental system was particularly brilliant. Hans would be charged premium rates for equipment that was basically medieval death traps held together with prayer and rust. A pickaxe that would last maybe 3 weeks cost him 2 weeks' wages to rent. When it inevitably broke and nearly took his eye out, guess who got charged for the replacement? That's right, Hans got to pay for the honor of being maimed by defective equipment. Food costs were equally delightful. The mine owners sold Hans his daily rations at prices that would make modern airport vendors blush with shame. A bowl of turnip slop that cost them maybe half a pfennig to make got marked up to 4 pfennigs because, as Otto the Merciless explained, mountain delivery charges. The fact that the mountain was literally right there didn't seem to factor into their pricing strategy. Housing costs were the crown jewel of medieval financial fuckery. Hans paid rent for his corner of that delightful wooden box he shared with 5 other dying men. The mine owners charged each miner full rent, meaning they collected 6 times the actual housing costs while providing accommodations that wouldn't meet the standards of a medieval pigsty. Capitalism before capitalism had a name. But here's where it gets really beautiful: debt inheritance. When miners died, and they died a lot, their debts didn't die with them. Oh no, that would be too merciful. The mine owners would graciously transfer the debt to the dead miner's family, because apparently being widowed and orphaned wasn't punishment enough. Klaus's predecessor, Johann the Previously Alive, had left behind a wife and 3 kids who were still paying off his tool rental fees 2 years after a cave-in turned him into mountain paste. The interest rates on minor debt were calculated using advanced medieval mathematics that basically boiled down to however much we can get away with. Miss a payment because you were trapped underground during a flood. That's a penalty fee. Get injured and can't work? Charging you storage fees for keeping your job open. Still breathing after a gas explosion? Medical recovery surcharge. Hans quickly learned that questioning these charges was about as healthy as licking mining tools. Miners who complained about the accounting found themselves assigned to the most dangerous sections of the mine, where mysterious accidents happened with suspicious frequency. Amazing how cave-ins always seem to target the troublemakers. The mine owners maintained detailed ledgers tracking every pfennig owed by every miner, while conveniently losing track of safety equipment, adequate food supplies, or basic human decency. They could tell you exactly how much Hans owed for candle wax from 3 months ago, but somehow couldn't remember to provide rope that wouldn't snap under the weight of a small child. Klaus had developed his own accounting system. If I'm still breathing tomorrow, I'm ahead of the game. Medieval financial planning at its finest. Chapter 7. Sickness in the Shadows. All right, fellow insomniacs, buckle up for the next ordeal in the life of a medieval miner, medical care. Or, more accurately, the medieval equivalent of sticking your head in a bucket and hoping for the best. When accidents in the mines inevitably happened, and believe me, they happened frequently, the healthcare available was laughable, horrifying, and could often make things worse. Hans had seen miners crushed under falling rocks, burned by explosions, and poisoned by gases, only to be treated by barbers, shamans, or whoever had the sharpest knife or the strongest constitution to pull off a miracle, usually a botched one. The closest thing to a hospital was a dirty room in the village where herbs, superstition, and prayer mingled in a stinky cloud of false hope and misery. Medicinal knowledge was so primitive that even simple broken bones were more likely to be worsened by the treatment than healed. If you broke a limb, the best you could hope for was a crude splint made from sticks and rags, usually soaked with who knows what, and a few prayers whispered through gritted teeth. Infection was the real killer. With no antibiotics or sterilization, even the tiniest cut could balloon into gangrene and death. The mere act of dressing wounds was often performed with tools and materials that would horrify modern medical professionals. Klaus once watched a village healer clean a miner's infected wound with the same knife he'd used to gut fish that morning. Medieval hygiene, where cross-contamination was just another word for efficiency. The legendary healers of the village had a frightening arsenal: leeches, bloodletting, poultices made from mud or animal fat, and chants performed by drunken priests. Hans watched in horror as a miner suffering from lung disease was made to inhale steam mixed with herbs, an ancient recipe that did nothing but cause more coughing and wheezing. The theory was that bad vapours needed to be driven out by slightly different bad vapours. One particularly grim tale was that of old Fritz, who had lost an eye to a mining accident. Rather than proper medical care, the village healer simply took a hot iron to cauterize the wound, a procedure so excruciating that Fritz later claimed he would have preferred falling down a shaft instead. The iron wasn't cleaned, the wound wasn't properly prepared, and surprise, surprise, infection set in. Fritz died a slow, painful death, the kind no one wanted to witness but all expected. Medieval pain management consisted mainly of getting drunk or passing out from agony. If you were lucky, they'd give you a stick to bite on. If you were unlucky, they'd hold you down and tell you to pray harder. Klaus had developed his own pain relief strategy. If it hurts so bad you can't think about it, you're probably healing. Hans realized that if you were unlucky enough to get injured or seriously ill, the mines were a death sentence with a waiting period. There was no workers' comp, no sick leave, no decent care. Only a fate of abandonment or brutal, sometimes experimental, treatment. The mine owners didn't want injured miners wasting time or resources. They wanted bodies pulling ore, not bodies dying in agony. The village's medical philosophy was basically, if God wanted you to live, you wouldn't have gotten hurt in the first place. Injured miners were often seen as morally deficient, their accidents attributed to insufficient piety or secret sins, because apparently the mountain was God's quality control inspector. Even the burials were grim affairs. Miners who died underground were often hastily thrown into mass graves, their bodies covered in dirt and dust without ceremony. The church might offer prayers for the souls, but the mercy shown was mostly for the living who had to carry on. Death certificates weren't a thing yet, so cause of death was usually listed as God's will or mountain-related. Yet despite the catastrophic medical realities, Hans and Klaus found strange, raw moments of kindness among the villagers. Fellow miners would bandage wounds as best they could, share what little herbal medicine they had, and hold the hands of dying friends as they faced the end with bitter acceptance. It was a desperate camaraderie forged in the shadow of death. The irony wasn't lost on Hans that he spent his days extracting silver that would eventually fund better medical care for rich people, while he had to trust his life to village healers who thought bloodletting was the cure for everything from headaches to severed limbs. If you thought the tunnels were a nightmare, wait until you hear what it was like to survive an Alpine winter in medieval times. Spoiler alert, it was brutal, unforgiving, and often deadlier than the mines themselves. Hans had barely crawled out of the mine after a 12-hour shift, lungs coated with dust and muscles screaming in agony, when the icy slap of the Alpine winter hit him like a physical blow. Unlike the controlled environment of a mine shaft, the outside world offered no warmth, no shelter, just endless cold, biting winds, and snow that could bury a man alive if he faltered for a second. Housing in the mining villages was as poor as ever. The wooden shacks with their gaps and holes became wind tunnels, and heating was a luxury few could afford. Fires were small, often shared among 6 or more miners cramped into their coffin-like rooms. The smoke would curl through the tiny cracks, filling the space with a choking haze, which did little to ease the cold but only made breathing harder. Food scarcity worsened in winter. The possibility of fresh produce vanished, leaving miners to subsist on stale bread, turnip slop, and whatever root vegetables they could store. Nutrition was at its lowest when the body needed it most to fight off the cold. Hans's health deteriorated each winter, his cough worsening as cold air aggravated his already damaged lungs. Snowstorms could trap entire villages, cutting them off from trade routes and supplies. Medicine, tools, and even basic necessities became nearly impossible to obtain. When miners fell sick or injured during these times, their chances of survival plummeted. Klaus recounted one winter when a snowdrift blocked their path to the nearest town for weeks, leaving several miners to die from untreated infections and exposure. The clothing miners wore was laughable by modern standards. Wool was expensive and scarce. Many relied on layers of rough, patched linen that barely kept the worst of the cold out. Faces, hands, and feet were exposed to frostbite and chilblains, which could cause excruciating pain and permanent damage. Hans lost several fingers over the years, claiming them as casualties of the mountain rather than the mine. Travel to and from the mines became a test of endurance. The steep mountain paths were slippery with ice, and accidents were common. Frozen trails meant that a simple misstep could result in a deadly fall down rocky ravines. Miners often had to rely on makeshift crampons or poles for balance, but these were also prone to breaking or slipping, turning the journey home into a lottery of survival. Winter wasn't just a physical battle, but a mental one too. The isolation, darkness, and constant cold crushed spirits. Seasons blurred together as miners counted days by snowfalls rather than calendars. Many turned to drink and dark humour to keep their sanity, sharing grotesque jokes about frozen faces and the next guy likely to slip under the ice. The irony was that while Hans and Klaus froze above ground, they actually looked forward to descending into the mines where the temperature remained a consistent 40° F. Underground became their warming hut, which tells you everything you need to know about how brutal Alpine winters were. Despite the relentless hardships, the community showed resilience. Shared fires, communal meals when supplies allowed, and mutual care offered some relief. Klaus organized informal patrols to check on isolated miners and bring them food or firewood when storms hit unexpectedly. These small acts of solidarity were often the difference between life and death. Alpine winters also affected the mines themselves. Water pumps froze or broke, ventilation slowed, making underground conditions even more hazardous. Frozen ground shifted unpredictably, causing unexpected cave-ins. The mountain's wrath extended above and below, a constant, unyielding menace. Hans and Klaus learned to respect winter as much as the mountain itself. It was a season that tested every ounce of their endurance, courage, and hope. Surviving it was as much an act of defiance as mining the precious silver beneath their feet. Chapter 8. Little Hands, Big Holes. We've seen how the mountain claimed its adult victims, but now it's time to explore one of medieval mining's darkest corners, child labour. The youngest souls, some not older than 10, were forced into this brutal life, their childhood stolen by the mountain's insatiable hunger for silver. This is a grim tale of innocence lost and survival against impossible odds. Hans recalled when he was just 10 years old, dragged by his father into the mine for the first time. The dim light barely reached the narrow tunnels, the air thick with dust and danger. It wasn't playtime, it was a forced trial by fire. Small bodies were prized for tasks impossible for adults, crawling through tight spaces, carrying loads just heavy enough to wear them down, and serving as human signals when gas levels became deadly. Child labour wasn't a matter of choice, but of necessity. Families were so desperate that every pair of hands counted, and even the youngest children worked to keep their kin from starving. Education was a luxury the miners' families couldn't afford. Survival was the only curriculum. Klaus often joked bitterly that school, for mining kids, meant learning which rocks were most likely to crush you, and which coughs meant you were dying faster than usual. The tasks children performed were often the most dangerous. They carried buckets filled with ore up slippery ladders, monitored unstable tunnels for signs of collapse, and worked in areas with the worst air quality because their small frames used less oxygen and made less noise. Many children suffered from respiratory illnesses and physical deformities from early and prolonged exposure to the harsh underground environment. Hans remembered his little brother Wilhelm, barely 8 years old, who developed what the miners called child's curse, a racking cough that brought up blood and rock dust in equal measure. Wilhelm never grew taller than a pickaxe handle, because his lungs couldn't process enough oxygen to fuel normal growth. He died at 12, looking like a shriveled old man, his childhood literally crushed out of him by the mountain's weight. Here's your delightful medieval childhood development fact. Mining children had a life expectancy of about 15 years. Not 15 years of work, 15 years total. They'd start working at 6 or 7, be completely broken by 12, and dead by 15 if they were unlucky enough to survive that long. Medieval family planning at its absolute finest. The mine owners had developed specific uses for different aged children. 6-year-olds were perfect for crawling through ventilation shafts to clear blockages. Their small size meant they used less air and could fit through spaces that would trap adults. 10-year-olds had the strength to carry small loads, but were still expendable enough that losing a few didn't affect the bottom line. Teenagers were considered experienced workers, right up until they collapsed from lung disease or got crushed by falling rocks. Child supervision was handled with the same care and attention as everything else in medieval mining, barely at all. Adult miners were too busy trying not to die to properly watch children, so kids essentially raised each other in an underground Lord of the Flies scenario. They developed their own hierarchy, survival strategies, and ways of protecting the youngest from the worst dangers. The really beautiful part was how mine owners justified child labour. Children need to learn trades, they'd declare while counting silver coins. Mining builds character and teaches valuable life skills. The valuable life skills apparently included how to die horribly before reaching puberty, and advanced techniques for coughing up your internal organs. Living conditions for mining children were exactly what you'd expect. They slept in corners of the same death-trap shacks as the adults, sharing space, disease, and the constant fear that tomorrow might be their last day above ground. Their clothes were whatever scraps the adults had outgrown, providing about as much protection as their prayers, which is to say, none whatsoever. Despite this nightmare, children showed remarkable resilience. They created games out of survival, contests to see who could hold their breath longest in bad air, races through dangerous tunnels, and elaborate storytelling sessions where they'd imagine lives beyond the mountain. These tiny acts of rebellion against their circumstances kept their spirits alive even as their bodies slowly died. But even the strongest spirits had limits. Hans watched friends disappear regularly, some to accidents, some to disease, and some who simply gave up and walked into the deepest, most dangerous parts of the mine, never to return. The mountain consumed children like a hungry beast, and there were always more desperate families willing to feed it their young. The worst part wasn't even the dying, it was watching children lose their humanity. By age 10, mining kids had seen enough death and suffering to break most adults. They'd developed the emotional distance of battlefield surgeons, treating fatal accidents as routine inconveniences and their own impending deaths as scheduling conflicts. Religion was woven into the daily lives of miners like a double-edged sword, offering comfort but also exploitation. The church, while preaching salvation and hope, often sided with the mine owners, providing divine justification for suffering and obedience. Hans and Klaus had grown up hearing how their toil was a holy sacrifice, and that enduring pain was a path to heavenly reward. But this spiritual balm was thin, often barely masking the cold misery of their daily realities. St. Barbara, the patron saint of miners, was both a symbol of protection and a bitter reminder of mortality. Miners painted her image at the shaft entrances and whispered prayers for safety, yet many knew these pleas often went unanswered. Klaus mocked the practice, calling her saint of ceremonial waiting, a sarcastic jab at praying for deliverance while the mountains steadily claimed more lives. Her feast day became a dark joke among the miners. St. Barbara's Day, the one day a year we pretend the mountain gives a shit about our prayers. The church collected tithes from the very miners it urged to accept their lot quietly. Clergy members lived comfortably off these contributions, far from the squalor and danger below. Father Wilhelm, their village priest, had never set foot in the mines but felt perfectly qualified to lecture dying men about accepting God's will. He'd grown fat on miners' coins while preaching about the nobility of poverty and suffering. Hans recalled a particularly heated evening when a group of miners confronted Father Wilhelm, demanding better support and acknowledgement of their suffering. The priest's response was calm but dismissive, reminding them that earthly struggles were trials from God and that only faith could provide true solace. "Your suffering is temporary," he declared, "but your salvation is eternal." The conversation ended with some miners spitting on the ground, their respect for the church eroding amidst growing despair. The really beautiful part was how the church justified the mining industry's brutality through theological gymnastics. Miners' deaths weren't tragic accidents, they were God calling his faithful servants home. Cave-ins weren't the result of negligent safety practices, they were divine tests of character. And lung disease wasn't preventable occupational illness, it was purification through holy suffering. Sunday sermons were masterpieces of victim-blaming, disguised as spiritual guidance. Father Wilhelm would preach about how earthly wealth corrupted the soul, while literally counting silver coins donated by men who were dying to extract that same silver. The irony was lost on no one, except apparently the clergy themselves. Despite institutional complicity, religion remained a complex lifeline for many miners. They found personal solace in prayer, hymns, and visiting the chapel when the weight of death felt too heavy to bear. Klaus confessed that sometimes, in the darkest moments underground, the faint memory of a hymn or a whispered prayer was the only thing keeping him from giving up entirely. The miners had developed their own folk Christianity, mixing official doctrine with practical superstition and dark humour. They'd pray to St. Barbara before descending, then immediately curse her name when their prayers went unanswered. They attended Mass on Sundays, then spent Monday through Saturday questioning why God seemed to hate them specifically. Yet this faith was constantly tested by harsh reality. The village cemetery was expanding faster than the village itself, filled with simple wooden crosses marking lives cut short by preventable deaths. Funerals were modest affairs, attended by small clusters of grieving friends and family, hastily conducted because everyone knew there'd be another one soon enough. The standard funeral blessing had been shortened from 10 minutes to 5 because Father Wilhelm was getting tired of performing the same service multiple times per week. The dual role of religion, as a source of hope and a pillar of the oppressive system, crystallized the miners' bitter relationship with faith. It was both an anchor and a chain, offering comfort while demanding submission to their circumstances. Hans learned to separate the God he prayed to in desperate moments from the church that profited from his misery. The mountain continued its relentless harvest of human lives, while the church continued blessing the system that fed it fresh victims, and the miners continued hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone up there was listening to their prayers for deliverance. Chapter 10. Family Suffering. The relentless cycle of death and poverty carved deep scars not only in the bodies of miners but in their families and communities. Widows became a common fixture in each village, their husbands claimed by collapses, gas, or disease, often leaving behind young children in desperate straits. Hans's own wife Greta faced this grim reality constantly. Loss was a shadow stalking every household. Some women took jobs in the mines or scavenged from the mountain's detritus to keep their families fed. Greta had perfected the art of survival economics, a brutal calculus of which children to feed first when food ran out, which tools to sell when Hans couldn't work due to injury, and which debts could be delayed before the mine owners sent their collectors. She'd learned to read the signs. When Hans's cough turned bloody, she'd start mentally preparing for widowhood. When his breathing became laboured, she'd quietly inventory their meagre possessions. Medieval women didn't have the luxury of denial. They had to be prepared for disaster at all times. Children grew up too fast, and survival became the family business. With fathers gone or incapacitated, young boys were thrust into mining roles before their bodies could bear the strain. Hans's son Otto, barely 12 years old, already showed the telltale signs of miners' inheritance: stunted growth, persistent cough, and the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd seen too much death too early. Girls worked domestically, often in unspeakable conditions, while mothers tried to hold the fragile threads of family life together with nothing but determination and prayer. The poverty was cyclical and self-reinforcing. Dead miners meant fewer breadwinners. Sick miners meant heavier workloads for the surviving family members. Debts inherited by families meant endless servitude stretching across generations. The mountains sucked not only the silver from the earth, but also drained generations of vitality, hope, and human potential. Hans often walked through the village streets, noticing the same faces worn down by hardship for decades, the same families forever trapped in the mining cycle like insects in amber. Klaus's wife Anna had buried 3 husbands, all miners, and was already eyeing potential 4th candidates with the practical detachment of someone shopping for livestock. Love is a luxury for rich people, she'd tell younger wives. Survival requires backup plans. She'd trained her daughters to evaluate potential husbands based on lung capacity, accident history, and debt levels rather than romantic compatibility. The social fabric was frayed beyond recognition. Orphans were common, many taken in by relatives already struggling to feed their own families, or forced into workhouses where conditions made the mines look comfortable. Widows faced social marginalization and economic precarity, with little to no community support. Disease and malnutrition were rampant, spreading rapidly in overcrowded and unsanitary living conditions, where entire families shared single rooms with the structural integrity of medieval wishful thinking. Yet, amid this crushing despair, life found ways to persist with the stubborn resilience of weeds growing through cobblestones. Familial bonds, however strained by poverty and loss, endured. Shared stories of survival united the community in their misery. Festivals honouring the dead became sombre reminders of the costs borne, reinforcing both grief and a perverse pride in their ability to endure the unendurable. Hans's daughter Gretchen grew up hearing tales of her father's and grandfather's work, instilling in her a reluctant pride intertwined with deep sorrow. She learned to clean mining wounds, recognize different types of lung disease by sound, and prepare herbal remedies that might ease suffering even if they couldn't prevent death. These weren't skills any child should need, but necessity had long since abandoned any pretense of childhood innocence. This cycle wasn't just socio-economic. It was spiritual and psychological torture disguised as tradition. Children watched parents wither away, neighbours vanish, and yet they remained tethered to the mountain by poverty, religion, and lack of alternatives. Dreams of escape were smothered by practicality and fear, as migration meant potential starvation in unfamiliar lands where they had no connections, skills, or resources. The mine owners and landlords capitalized on this desperation like medieval loan sharks, buying loyalty with promises that were rarely fulfilled and wielding authority through both economic control and social manipulation. The circle tightened, generation by generation, with families beholden to debts incurred by their grandfathers, trapping them in a multi-spectral web of dependency that made escape virtually impossible. Hans saw the toll the mining lifestyle took on marriages, childhoods, and entire family structures, the endless grieving, the shared fear, and the small moments of joy that carried families through long, dark winters. He couldn't help but think that the mountain claimed more than bodies. It claimed lives, souls, and futures, shaping entire bloodlines into something broken but enduring. The mountain's appetite was intergenerational, feeding on the desperation of families who had no choice but to offer up their children as sacrifices to the same beast that had devoured their ancestors. Although the mountain holds its secrets tightly, echoes of the miners' suffering ripple through history in unexpected ways. The silver extracted from the Austrian Alps didn't just fill royal treasuries, it shaped the very fabric of medieval society, influencing trade, warfare, religion, and culture across Europe. The wealth minted here paved the way for transformative eras, yet was bought with human anguish that was systematic and largely invisible to those who enjoyed its fruits. Germany and Austria became banking and trading powerhouses, partly thanks to the influx of silver. The miners' toil fought invisible battles far beyond mountain tunnels, enabling monarchs to finance armies, fund explorations, and empower the rise of cities. Yet, while historians often praise this economic growth, the individual lives crushed beneath the mountain remain footnotes. Hans and Klaus were just two names among thousands whose labour built European civilization, while their own lives remained trapped in cycles of poverty and despair. The relationship between mining regions and the emerging European states was complex. Nobles and royalty established monopolies, controlling mines with iron fists, highlighting early forms of state capitalism. The exploitation was not only of natural resources, but also of human bodies. Miners, considered expendable, bore the brunt of this nascent system. The Habsburg dynasty, in particular, built much of its power on Alpine silver, using mineral wealth to fund their expansive European empire, while the miners who made it possible lived in conditions that barely qualified as human existence. Medieval banking houses like the Fuggers became financial titans by investing in Alpine mining operations, developing credit systems and international trade networks that would shape European economics for centuries. The silver that Klaus extracted with his bare hands and primitive tools ended up financing everything from the Crusades to cathedral construction, from royal weddings to military campaigns. Yet Klaus himself never earned enough to buy a decent meal or escape his mountain prison. Meanwhile, the church's involvement in mining wealth was a double-edged emblem of medieval power and hypocrisy. It accumulated vast wealth from tithes on mineral profits, funding cathedrals and monasteries whose grandeur stood in stark contrast to the squalor of mining villages. But its spiritual care for miners was inconsistent, often reinforcing social hierarchies and encouraging resignation to suffering. This institutional contradiction shaped how communities perceived faith amidst hardship, creating a bitter relationship between organized religion and the working poor that would persist for centuries. Environmentally, centuries of extraction left scars soon forgotten amid urban growth and shifting economic centers. The later Industrial Revolution, centuries removed, would carry forward the legacies of mining, both in technological innovation and environmental degradation. The Alpine mines, in a way, laid foundational patterns of resource extraction regulation and neglect that continue to influence how societies balance economic development with environmental protection. The mercury and arsenic used in silver processing created toxic wastelands that remained poisonous for generations. Entire forest ecosystems were stripped bare to fuel smelting operations, while toxic runoff contaminated water sources for miles downstream. These environmental costs were never factored into the economic calculations of medieval mine owners, establishing a pattern of environmental externalization that would plague industrial development for centuries to come. And that, my sleepless friends, is where we leave the frozen shafts, the coughing ghosts, and the mountain that never cared. If you're still awake, congratulations, your lungs worked better than Hans's ever did. Remember, every shiny antique coin you see in a museum once gleamed with somebody's blood-sweat cocktail. So next time you romanticize medieval castles or Instagram those Alpine peaks, spare a thought, and maybe a sarcastic prayer for the miners who paid the entry fee to history. If you enjoyed this midnight descent into misery, smash that mental like button, fluff your pillow of existential dread, and join me next time as we dig up another chapter the textbooks politely ignored. Until then, stay curious, stay critical, and, most importantly, get some sleep. The Drowsy Historian, signing off.